Good afternoon. Great pleasure to have you here and see some new faces. We've been in a workshop basically the whole day. And the idea was to think about European issues right on top of the agenda and starting there from a Franco-German perspective. I have to confess, I never liked this narrowing down on Franco-German because Europe is, of course, about still 28 member states. Might be more, might become more. So it's crucial to have anybody and everybody involved. And the structure which we put on our workshop was starting off, and I was forced by Karl Kaiser to do that, to add a transatlantic dimension to that. So it's about Europe in a larger context which has been changing quite dramatically over the last few years. And then we digged into more economic topics. It was analysis and policy implications. So that's the background of our workshop this morning and this afternoon. What we would like to do now is to briefly present what we've discussed and then also to have as much interaction as possible. We have lost one of the panelists, but we have an extraordinary replacement for one of our panel members. He will come in the debate, but we have eminent contributors here. So the first who will start off is Henrik Enderlein, who's been working on European and Franco-German issues for a very long time. He is professor of political economics and president of the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. Then we will have Jean Pisani-Ferry, who has been involved also in many European policy debates, and he has been particularly influential as director of Bruegel for numerous years, which he launched in the early 2000s. And he has also been director of Stratégie France, which was called France Stratégie, which was called before or known before as Commissariat Général du Plan, and is now again working as senior fellow at Bruegel and at the European University Institute. We will have two external perspectives, though not external in terms of not having worked on these issues. One is Vivian Schmidt, who has been analyzing European policy issues, in particular from a legitimacy perspective, and Jacob Frankel. Jeff.
Okay. You're not one of the first 100 people to make that mistake.
So it's the first time happening to me. And Jeff has been talking about working on European issues for decades, and over the last decade he came up with a list of ever longer list of flaws of Europe. Architectural flaws and architectural failures. And then ultimately I will also ask Jakob von Weizsäcker to come in. He is the only real policymaker in our debate here. So without further ado, Henrik, may I ask you to come in?
Thank you, Hans Helmut. And I think it's a good sign that here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at Harvard, at the Center for European Studies, there is a discussion involving France and Germany from this transatlantic perspective. And the reason is that if you ask today who can drive the European project, who can put energy into the European project, you go through the list. The first one is the European Commission. It has just been appointed. It's not off to a very good start, and the Spitzenkandidaten process was not followed in the way that many had seen. I think, to be on record, not for the wrong reasons. I was not very fond of Manfred Weber as a candidate, But clearly, this is not the politically mandated commission that you would see as the driver for the future of Europe. Then you ask, what about the other actors, in particular European governments? And you realize if you take the list of the largest 6 countries in the European Union, you look at Poland, number 6 on the list, not exactly the driver of European integration these days. Next on the list is Spain, with all the internal political difficulties we know. Next on the list is Italy. Next on the list is UK. And then we have France and Germany. And so France and Germany are really the 2 countries that need to push the European project. That's my first point. My second point is if you look at the Franco-German relation, especially with regard to the euro, you realize that to some extent they come from Mars and Venus. And the best way to explain this is go back to the early days of the euro. The euro is often described as a political project, but there were 2 ways to implement it. One was the German idea, which was to say, well, the currency always comes at the end. You first need to create an integrated, homogeneous economic space. And once you've achieved this and you have actually reached full integration, then the crowning theory, you put the currency last on top and then you have achieved integration. The French perspective was always the opposite, to say, no, let's start with a common currency, but let's put into place political tools, which France always called gouvernement économique, and no one ever really understood what it meant. But let's give us the tools to make sure that once we have this currency and our gouvernement économique, we move to a fully integrated economic sphere, and ultimately the result is the same as with the German proposal. Now in Maastricht, France and Germany came to a compromise. And this compromise was, let's do the currency immediately, but let's do nothing that actually helps us get our European economies closer together. That's essentially how the euro was born, and that compromise is one of the original sins of the euro. Now, fast forward, I'm saying this as an introduction, a second point, because the third point is, in the euro area crisis, exactly this discussion came back. France was focusing on this idea of actually having decision structures that would help alleviate the shocks, whereas Germany said we have a strict rule framework which we need to preserve, otherwise we put into question the credibility of our common currency, and this is not going to work. And I think the past 5 to 10 years were bringing together many French people, many German people in ministries, in academia, many here at this workshop today, that try to make sure that France and Germany somehow would reach common ground. And here I end my introduction and move to, I have 2 big points and then I end. Today, I think this discussion is over. I think France and Germany no longer work together on deepening economic and monetary union, on actually pushing Europe forward. There are more misunderstandings and more disagreements than actual joint actions. The euro area budget, which was a big Macron idea, not only from the election campaign, but then also from the Sorbonne speech, has now been more or less adopted, but it's so small you would lose it in this room here. It's 17 billion euros for the entire euro area over a certain period of time, and that is just not enough. So it's not an economically visible euro area budget. The other idea France has had, which was an automatic stabilization mechanism in order to alleviate asymmetric shocks, is also something that was simply put, if you're nice, you say on the back burner. If you're not nice, you actually ask what's behind the back burner, and it somehow fell off the kitchen or whatever you have there. So that's where we are right now. And in that sense, I think perhaps it's also a moment for us, advisors, academics, think tankers, to say, perhaps it's not worthwhile pushing this. If you ask me whether there are proposals out there that could be reactivated in order to make progress on the Franco-German front, yes, there are. Jean and I were on a group of 14 economists from France and Germany, and we put together a quite encompassing, balanced package of reform proposals for the euro area. And you can read the 7+7 report. If you ask me today, what's the likelihood more than one of these proposals or two will be implemented, I think the likelihood is something like 5% or 10% for the next 20 years. So I think the likelihood something will happen is very low. So that's the big take-home message. The Franco-German engine on this front no longer works, and perhaps it's time to acknowledge it. Now, the other big point, and then I end, is what should France and Germany be working on now? And as I briefly outlined this morning in the workshop, I think we need to find new definitions of what the European economy is about. It's no longer about the crisis. It's no longer about interest rate spreads. It's no longer about the ESM. This will come back in a crisis, and yes, it will come back. But for the time being, that's not where we should spend our energy. Our energy should be on the other areas, which is driving economic growth in the European Union, and there is a lot to be done. France and Germany could be working together, for example, on creating joint regulatory spaces between the two countries by agreeing on a single rule book. Think about digitalization. When I buy something on Amazon today in Germany and I buy something on Amazon in France, I actually strike two very different contracts. If I have a single integrated regulatory space, that's no longer needed. And so having this regulatory agreement, having a single rule book, having a joint legislation is the much more interesting part for France and Germany to move together. Another area which you could think about is this idea of industrial policy, where France and Germany could move on. So these are just suggestions for the discussion, and I end here. Why do I say all this in a transatlantic discussion? Well, today we have three poles: the US, China, and Europe. China and the US are redefining the rules of economic policy making. China basically has unlimited cheap labor, unlimited capital, unlimited markets, and unlimited political capital. The European Union is simply not up to the task right now to compete with these areas. And so I think we need a solid growth strategy. It needs to be based on France and Germany so that we can compete in the global world order. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henrik. Jean, you've been working on governance issues and European public goods. Could you elaborate on this?
Yeah, as you will see, the setup for the panel is that we start with a very pessimistic German voice. What you don't know yet is that we are going to end with a very optimistic German voice, and in between there are ups and downs. The point that I would like to start from is that we're facing... Okay, sorry, I turned it off. We're facing a significant redefinition of what Europe is about. Traditionally, the European project has been defined in terms of integration. So, integrate economically for efficiency reasons, integrate economically because economic integration is supposed to bring peace and political integration. And this engine has largely run out of steam. As Henrik actually was saying, and the Euro crisis was an illustration of the fact that integration can also bring difficulties, divergence, misunderstanding, and all that. What has changed is that whereas in a few years ago, the widespread view was that we had Europeans trying to integrate, and then you had globalization being built, being organized. And some question, and I think it was explicitly put forward by Gordon Brown when he was a chancellor. He said, why do we integrate at regional level? We should be integrating at global level. Efficiency is with global integration. So having a common European market doesn't make much sense. We should have a global, common global market. And this view actually was, never fully articulated by Franco-German politicians or even thinkers, but it was in the background, and there was more and more the question, why are we paying such a high political price trying to integrate, whereas the whole world is really the space for us, especially German exporters had often this attitude. Now, we suddenly discovered that we're in a completely different world. We're not in a world that's integrating globally. We're in a world that's fragmenting globally. We're in a world of rivalry. We're in a world of powers that do not distinguish between economic integration, economic dimension, economic relationship, and political, geopolitical concerns. So Europe is waking up to a world where we have the US and China, two major powers, that the rivalry is going to restructure international relations, including international economic relations, and that neither of them separates the economic dimension from the geopolitical dimension. So it has to sort of reinvent itself in this kind of world, asking itself, what do we want to play as a role externally? What are the European public goods? What part of it has to do with us being able to play our cards in the world? And how do we integrate better the geopolitical dimension, the economic dimension? And this is a very fundamental rethink, not only because we worked under the assumption that the focus was internal, but also because there was a sort of disconnect where the world was being organized by rules, by international institutions, with the benevolent support of the US. And then we could run our policies in silos. So we had a trade policy, we had a competition policy, we had regulatory policies, and each of them was run separately. And each of these policy was in interaction with a globally functioning world. So that's fundamental, and I think we are really at the start of this redefinition of what Europe is about in a very different world, which leads to questions about what do we want to achieve together, what do we want to defend together. How can we support the type of international relation we believe in? Now, at the same time, we're facing internal difficulties that have to do with the fact that also we are sort of coming to realize that part of this integration agenda that was common does not command the support, the consensus it used to be based on. And that a number of policies are increasingly, as a matter of principle, controversial within the EU. The most visible is whatever has to do with immigration and refugees. We have in principle a common system of visa that's decentralized but works on the basis of common rules. And we have in principle the same philosophy as regards asylum. But in practice, we have very different approaches to it. And some countries consider that welcoming asylum seekers is part of their constitution, it's part of their DNA, it's part of their duties. And some countries consider that it shouldn't be at all the case and that they don't want migrants full stop. And this is at the core of one of the common elements of integration. This is a major challenge. And we see that there is a split here. There is a less significant split, but nevertheless an important one, as regards the euro. We have some countries saying the euro is really the core of our project, is a sort of the frontier of our project. And we want to do whatever it takes to make sure the euro is viable. Some countries are saying we don't want the euro. I mean, the euro, we want to keep our own monetary policy. We want to keep our own exchange rate. And it's not anymore the fiction of everybody being moving in the same direction at different speeds. Is that simply the directions are not the same. And if you think of issues having to do, and we discussed that today, having to do with foreign and security policy, with attitudes, with a perception of risk, response to risk, willingness to make efforts for defense, is also the same. We have very different attitudes. So we also have at the same time to redefine how we manage a Europe that is not only a Europe of different speeds, but also a Europe in which permanently, or lastingly at least, there will be different types of integration with not all countries participating in the same model of integration. And that's for an entity that was built on the basis of very strong lock-in mechanisms, so that everybody has to sign on the fundamental treaty with all the goals in it, and everybody has sought to commit to integration, even though readiness to it may differ. This is also a fundamental change of perspective, and we have, I think, to draw the lessons from that and to make it work. A Europe that has different circles, that including a sort of outer circle of countries that are not able to join the EU now, or that the EU members don't want to join now, but with which we have to organize a structured relationship, not to leave them in a limbo. So this redefinition of what are the common policy and who participates in them. And to me, it has to be built on a club models where there is a basis that's common to everyone, but adds on that concerns certain countries for the euro, for asylum, for foreign and security policies that have a different perspective. That's key also to this redefinition. So in fact, we are facing, and here I'm more optimistic than Henrik was about the possibility of France and Germany to agree on that. I think we're facing a new set of problems. We're facing a new set of challenges on which perhaps the sort of existing disagreements are less pronounced, that they are on some issues that have been discussed for so many years without finding a common solution. There are different interests, but that's a sort of normal part of a discussion amongst member states. But there are new challenges that we've got to address together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One of the upcoming challenges might be a slowdown, significant slowdown in the world economy, which will in particular hit the small and open European economies, most strongly possibly Germany and other northern European economies. What would be the typical response of the American policymaker to a downturn?
So I take this as a invitation to shift to a shorter term perspective. First, let me say, it's often spoken as if the global recession is a fact. It's not a fact yet. Economists cannot predict recessions and don't claim to be able to. But I think it's fair to say that the odds have gone up. The IMF just released its semi-annual World Economic Outlook, marked down the global growth rate to 3%, which is some sort of recession, growth recession or something. And for Europe, it's worse, especially as Hans Helmut indicates for Germany. One of the factors leading us all to fear or to explain what's already happened as far as a slowdown, of course, is trade war, which was unwisely launched by the U.S. president. The odds of recession in the next year in the U.S., I would say, are no worse than 50-50, but they are worse than that in Europe, and especially Germany, which is, as Hans Helmut said, is more exposed, more dependent on trade, which most of the time is a good thing. It's usually is a lot of reasons still to believe, I believe still, that trade is good for growth in the long term. But it does leave you more exposed to world events such as a trade war. Germany has already experienced one negative quarter of growth in the second quarter. The practice in Europe, as in not all the world, but most of the world, is to define a recession as 2 consecutive negative quarters. Probably the third quarter is negative. The Bundesbank has, I think, said yesterday that it was expecting this, and as I understand it, maybe the statistical office next week will announce what the third quarter growth rate was for Germany. And if it's negative, that puts Germany technically into recession. France is also forecast to slow down. Has already slowed down. It's less exposed to trade than Germany is, and I would say its problems tend to be more structural, and the policy solutions more structural than macroeconomic. But the IMF's numbers, for what it's worth, for the year 2019 is 0.5% growth for Germany, barely positive, and 1.2% growth for France. If these countries and the world don't have a recession within the next year, it'll come eventually. I mean, there's always going to be another recession, and rather than pretending that's not true or trying to forecast it, I think the best way to spend our attention is to think about how to prepare for it, how to make one's country less vulnerable to it. And being prepared for it means having a sensible framework for fiscal policy, and I would also say monetary policy and financial regulation. Germany's leaders and America's leaders have something in common, that they are among politicians who, in my view, have failed lately the fairly minimal test for countercyclical policy. Countercyclical meaning you run a strong budget during a boom, and you then loosen up and allow deficits during a recession. When I say they failed the test, they're actually acting pro-cyclically. Which is not unprecedented. The developing countries, commodity producers in particular, have a long experience of acting pro-cyclically in their policy, exaggerating the swings that would be occurring naturally. A most specific example I have in mind is the U.S. should not have launched a fiscal stimulus in December 2017, in particular the tax cut and some spending, the corporate tax cut and some spending increases. We are at the peak of the business cycle. It's exactly the wrong time to launch a fiscal stimulus, and it leaves us with much less fiscal space to respond in the event that or if and when the recession does come. As for Germany, I think it was pro-cyclical to push for so much austerity in Europe after the 2008 and 2010 crises, 2008 global financial crisis, 2010 euro crisis. I think domestically it should now be jettisoning the fiscal surplus that was attained under the Schwarze Null, the Black Zero policy, and should be preparing to run as much of a deficit as it is legally permissible under the debt brake. The form it should take, infrastructure investment. Hans Helmut always reminds me that's mainly done at the local, region, the Länder level or the municipal level, but surely there are ways for the federal government to encourage that. Maybe cutting payroll taxes. They're good uses for spending. Now, of course, ever since the crises of 2008 and 2010, Germany has received lots of criticism for its current account surplus and a lot of urging, particularly from other European countries, to undertake a fiscal stimulus. And up until now, it's had a pretty plausible excuse, namely it recovered from the global recession pretty quickly, and as of a few years ago, fiscal stimulus would have run the risk of overheating in Germany and could show up as an inflation or in asset prices. So, I mean, that was a pretty good argument. But that argument is gone now, clearly. The domestic overheating excuse is gone now that the economy is weakening. And fiscal policy is not subject to either of the two constraints that bind monetary policy, one of which is ineffectiveness at the zero lower bound or the effective lower bound, and the other is, by design, a common uniform policy across the Eurozone. Some say we should concentrate on monetary policy because fiscal policy is constrained. I hear this all the time. In my line of work as a macroeconomist, there seem to be more conferences on monetary policy and trying to debate about what the inflation target should be or unconventional monetary policy, quantitative easing and all that. And when it comes to fiscal policy, most of the time they say, oh, that's politically constrained. And it's politically constrained in Europe as well. But monetary policy has constraints of its own, and I want to mention three. First, the Fed and the ECB, especially the Fed, have lately both been subject to outside political pressure to a greater extent than before. I mean, Mario Draghi and the ECB has been newly criticized for lowering interest rates for expansion, and the Fed is under unprecedented attack from the U.S. president for having interest rates too high. I think they're both sort of exactly backwards. But more importantly, aside from the political pressure, it's a constraint, the inherent constraint of a monetary union that you have to set a common monetary policy, not just for Germany, but for all of the Eurozone, and the monetary policy that suits current conditions in Germany is not necessarily the same as a monetary policy that suits other countries, Ireland, for example. So that's an inherent constraint. And number three, even aside from the political constraints and the constraint that you're setting a common monetary policy for all of Europe is the zero lower bound or the effective lower bound. That I do think that what the ECB under Draghi has done and what the Fed has done in unconventional monetary policy has been useful, but much less effective than a fiscal policy would have been in the early years after the global financial crisis. And we're back in that situation again, probably if there's a new recession. So that brings us back to fiscal policy in my mind. And as far as the political constraint that the political leaders are screwing it up, to my mind, if we outside observers have any role, it's precisely to think about it and to talk about it and say it out loud when the political process is producing the wrong outcome, as it has been in fiscal policy, rather than staying in the more comfortable, safe zone of monetary policy.
Thank you very much, Jeff. There's a deeply grounded frustration amongst many Europeans, which shows in elections, which shows in a fragmentation of party systems all over Europe. Frustration about monetary policy, so legitimacy is pretty much undermined. How can one deal with that, Vivian?
Okay. Yes, so Europe is suffering from a crisis of legitimacy right now, and it's, I would argue, largely due to its policy responses that have resulted in, basically, it's policy crises that have resulted in political crisis as well. But if we're going to talk about legitimacy, we have to ask ourselves, how do you define legitimacy? And I see it two ways. One is the most basic Weberian way, public consent to governing authority. And actually the EU has gained that over time in policy area after policy area. The second way of thinking about legitimacy is public acceptance or approval of the governing activities of a body. And what you could say is that too worked pretty well, but up until the EU's many crises starting in 2007, 2008. But when we think about governing activities, there are three different ways to think about legitimacy. One is the one often thinks of in terms of performance, legitimacy, the effectiveness of the policies, good economic performance, for example, often termed output legitimacy. And the other side of that is political legitimacy or input legitimacy, where we think about democratic representation, citizens participate, have something to say, and elites, governing elites, are responsive. Or you could add to that this all works for the public good, that the polity works in favor, is true to norms. And then the third kind of legitimacy in terms of governing activities is what I would call throughput legitimacy, if we want to use systems terms, but more generally, it's procedural legitimacy. It's things like accountability, transparency, inclusiveness, openness, even efficacy, which is a more technical rather than normative term. And the problem for the EU, as I just mentioned, is that it was actually reasonably okay on all of these three aspects of governing activity legitimacy until 2007, 2008. And you can see this in the Eurobarometer. You can also see that, yes, there was a rise of extremist anti-system parties through the 90s, largely fueled by anti-immigration policy. But in the 2000s, it plateaus. And then starting in 2008, it starts climbing. And it goes even higher in 2010 with the Eurozone crisis, and then it really takes off in 2015 as the migration crisis starts. So I thought I would just very briefly talk about legitimacy in a variety of different areas: Eurozone, migration, 2 words on Brexit, not more, perhaps rule of law, but I doubt that there'll be time. But these are all areas of crisis, of legitimacy. So if we take the Eurozone, in 2010, EU actors, what do? They first reinforced the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact. And this is what I call governing by rules and ruling by numbers. Since this is a conference on the Franco-German partnership, this was an example of the Franco-German partnership, Merkozy, with Merkel leading Sarkozy for the most part. And in a way, if we think about it in legitimacy terms, which we don't usually, what you can say is that EU institutional actors thought all we have to do is be procedurally legitimate, i.e. double down on the rules, we'll then have good economic performance legitimacy, and therefore it doesn't matter that there's no political input from the people, because they'll be happy anyway. But what happens? The crisis goes on. Legitimacy in all forms is more and more at risk. At risk from the bad policy performance. European economic growth is anemic everywhere. Program countries, it's a disaster. Southern Europe generally in problems. And we see increasing political volatility. We can also add that the European semester of oversight over national budgets is highly problematic because it's perceived as top-down diktats to national governments, even though actually it's a much more nuanced affair than that. So what happens? After 2 years, EU actors following Mario Draghi's will do whatever it takes to save the euro. Then what you see is a shift. EU actors begin to say, these rules aren't working, so we'll have to reinterpret the rules, which they do. But they do it by stealth. They can't admit it to anyone, which is itself a problem of legitimacy. Because even if you're accommodating, say, the Spaniards, they still feel oppressed because the discourse is saying we're following the rules, even though the actions are somewhat different. And of course, the Germans will feel deceived regardless, because there is increasing flexibility. And so what you see is the Commission increases flexibility, doesn't admit it in the discourse. The ECB does whatever it takes and then claims it's part of its mandate, which increasingly Germany rejects, or some Germans reject. The Council, what we can see is, having said it's all about stability, in 2012 adds growth to the discourse, even though it doesn't do much about it. Then in 2014 it adds flexibility, and by 2015 it adds investment. And what we see is there's improved performance. So in terms of in legitimacy, you get more performance legitimacy. It improves economic performance, but you still have suboptimal rules. The debt brake curbs investment. Deficit spending is not allowed for countries that don't have the so-called fiscal space, and those that do don't spend. And in terms of procedural legitimacy, the reinterpreting the rules by stealth is highly problematic. Accountability is in question. There's not much transparency. And especially if we think about the Eurogroup of finance ministers in terms of program countries, where they can do things in secret that they wouldn't possibly do had this been more general knowledge. So what happens? The result is increasing politicization, rise of populism. And we can talk about politicization at three levels: at the bottom, from the bottom up, and at the top. And at the bottom, populism, of course, is tremendously fueled by the Eurozone crisis. We see the decline of mainstream parties, especially on the center left. Many of those lose power and almost disappear. PASOK, the PS in France, but many fall dramatically. The PD in Italy, the SPD in Germany, even though there's some resurgence in Portugal we can talk about. But there's also and this is the important part of the story, the rise of challenger parties, mostly populist anti-system. We know on the right, the Eurosceptic parties, the AfD in Germany, Le Pen in France, the Lega in Italy. On the left, in Southern Europe in particular, Podemos, Syriza, and on, I would call this radical center, but it's the Five Star, which takes from the extremes on the right and the left. But you could also even take Macron's victory as a sign of the decline of the mainstream. And it's not anti-system, it's pro-system, but it's also populist in some sense of being anti-establishment at the time. And in addition to the rise of challenger parties, we have social movements expressing popular anger. And that's the Gilets jaunes in France, Pegida in Germany, and one can go on. And that's only the crisis at the bottom. From the bottom up, you can see the problems, this kind of tension at the bottom, fueling increasing divisions in the council. And at the top, these divisions are not only found in the council, but at the top you see increasingly politicized interactions amongst EU institutional actors. Northern European countries in the council accuse the Commission of using too much discretion, even so far as to propose a separate agency to do things. The Germans accuse the ECB of going beyond its remit in QE, and I don't mean all Germans, of course, just some. And the European Parliament accuses the Commission and the Council of a lack of accountability, transparency, etc. And Macron's proposals to go deeper to solve some of the problems of the Eurozone go nowhere. So then you have to ask the question, is politicization a bad thing or a good thing? Well, it's bad if you're looking at the substance of these accusations that basically accuse all the various actors of doing illegitimate things. At the same time, you could argue, well, wait a minute, the process is not bad. I'm not going to say it's good, but it's not bad, because actually, isn't this what democracies are about? More public contestation, deliberation, and ultimately compromise. So you could say that the procedural end may be more politically legitimate. Okay, so what can be done for the Eurozone? So I would argue more Europe and less at the same time. More Europe, do the things that haven't been done. At the very least, a European deposit insurance system, a real backstop for the Single Resolution Fund, perhaps a finance ministry, but certainly in a budget, a serious budget to do investments, unemployment adjustment funds, Eurobonds or safe assets, all of these things that deepen European integration, but at the same time, you need to democratize it. And for that, we need to talk about, well, for the macroeconomic governance, why not think about differentiated country-specific targets? Loosen these rules even more, but deliberate among EU actors so that it becomes, again, more transparent, but also more democratically legitimate. But even more importantly for the European semester, decentralize, give back, make it more bottom up than top down, in order to allow national governments to decide what works for them. But if none of this is possible, then less integration, and at the very least allow member states to not to count the deficits, not to count in their deficit which is more growth enhancing. I think I've just about run out of time, so I'll just say two more things. In terms of the migration crisis, there's actually been too little integration, and there doesn't seem to be a pathway forward. And here, the kind of integration, there needs to be, this is the EU that has claimed to be normative Europe for so long. It needs to continue to respect its goals, human rights, and all of that. So there need to be common standards for refugees and migrants. So in that sense, you can't have club governance here. At the same time, however, in the implementation, you could have clubs. You could have differentiation in the implementation, but there needs to be some kind of basic rules. But what we do know is political legitimacy has been a major problem in terms of the migration crisis. Brexit, threat of disintegration, I don't even want to go there, and I have no time to talk about rule of law, so I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Vivian. You basically made 2 points, if I can summarize. First, you basically made 2 points. First, flexibility by stealth, which is not seen very favorably by those who would like to see institutions abide by the rules. And the second was about more Europe and less Europe at the same time, for which you could make a case in terms of typical standard fiscal federalism. And there are very much conflicting views about those issues in the European debate for a very long time. If you give me a minute to talk about that, because I would like to introduce Jakob von Weizsäcker coming in. He was anticipated as the positive voice here. So there are different conflicting views about what policies should be pursued. In 2000, the Conseil Général, Commissariat Général du Plan, wrote a report. The author was Robert Boyer. And he thought about macroeconomic policy coordination at the time. And he had 4 scenarios. The first was Maastricht à la lettre. So we apply the rules. The second was we will have an insurance and rule-based system. The third was we will have fiscal federalism. So the first one was seen as completely ridiculous. Will never happen. The second rule-oriented system was perceived as being beyond reasonable. Federalism is a no-no in France, if I'm right. No? Federalism is something you do not really appreciate. And the final...
Don't use the word.
Right, it's the F word.
D'accord. And the final one was Marlene Throon. And
You can use the concept.
And we might be somehow at the end of this and have to come up with propositions that now work, and that's where Jakob comes in. May I help you with the mic?
Yeah, that's very, very kind of you. Look, I think what we've heard is that we're stuck. We're stuck for a variety of reasons. There are problems, not unsurmountable, but serious problems between France and Germany. There's serious problems between Northern and Southern Europe. There are serious problems which we haven't talked about so much between Western and Eastern Europe. There are problems between people like us in this room who could be doing our research, our jobs, our studies anywhere on this planet, and there are people whose life happens around 50 miles around the place where they were born. And they have a very different perspective, and that also plays a huge role in explaining why we're stuck. And one thing you can do, I mean, we're at an academic institution here. I used to study maths, and sometimes you have a problem in maths that is difficult to solve. And of course, one strategy is to, just sit at your desk and try to solve it and solve it again and solve it, and you get nowhere. Another strategy is to go for a walk, perhaps think about a different problem for a while. And I think that's what I would recommend. If you want to climb a mountain, and you didn't make it up the north face, you can try it again and again and again, but it's not going to get any easier. Perhaps there's a different route. And I think we have an invitation from history to try different routes, to try new problems as Europe. And perhaps in doing so, we may be able to even solve some of our current problems where we are stuck. And I think the two most important new problems that Europe is confronted with, on the one hand, is the return of geopolitics. Of course, after the Cold War was over, one was hoping that perhaps geopolitics was gone. Now there's US, China, and talk of decoupling and all the rest of it. And the interesting question, does that leave Europe with enormous challenges? And if we don't team up as Europe, I think life is going to be very difficult for us. And I would call this constructively, and Jean talked about that a little bit, the European public goods agenda. It's the agenda, security, defense, migration, development policy, but even digitalization and disruptive innovation and all the rest of it. There are many areas where we can achieve much greater degree of sovereignty in the EU, which I think, especially in France, people are keen on, but in Germany also. And I think we can achieve much better value for money, frankly, because if we manage to pool our resources at the European level and do something that actually works, I think it would be money much better spent. Appealing, I work for the German Ministry of Finance, appealing very much to the sort of things we have in mind when we think about Europe, waste and all the rest of it. So that could be an interesting Franco-German agenda, which is a productive one, and it could have very beneficial collateral, it could have collateral benefits for the euro area agenda, because one of the difficulties is, insurance is all very well, whether you do it by stealth or whether you do it explicitly, we need it. Stabilization is all very well, but it doesn't work if there's always this lingering suspicion. We just had Brexit, fortunately a country that didn't join the euro before, but we're having Brexit. Just imagine we have the country leaving the euro area. It would be devastating. And while we're not quite certain that this will never happen, it's extremely hard to engineer by stealth or democracy or input legitimacy. It's very hard to organize these things. If we have credible European public goods that add a lot of value, then leaving is such a bad idea that nobody will contemplate it, and that will make us much more certain that everybody stays on board. And there's a second, I think, very important development. It's the fact that we have very low interest rates, and they're set to stay very low for a long time. It's nice for the German Ministry of Finance. We can borrow, we can issue 30-year bonds at a negative nominal interest rate. If you subtract inflation from that, it's deeply negative. But surprisingly enough, even a country like Italy can issue long-running bonds at negative nominal interest rates. And even Greece, that's only true for the very short-term debt, but even Greece now is negative territory. So certain problems that we used to have, and they loomed large, they're much less important. And that's an opportunity, and it's not an opportunity so that I'm not misunderstood as somebody not belonging to the German Ministry of Finance to go out and spend, to go on a spending spree, but it's an enormous opportunity to do the kind of investments that will make us better off in the future. I mean, obviously, if one can borrow at negative rates, and there's sensible investment projects, for example, to do with energy transition, to do with slowing down and stopping climate change. There's a lot of mileage to be had, but that's true for many other activities that are beneficial, and I think that's an agenda we can pursue together. and in doing so, almost accidentally do a lot to stabilize the euro area, which is in dire need of stabilizing. I completely agree with the panelists. I just hope we don't try the direct route the umpteenth time, and instead, take perhaps an easier, a scenic detour that will have lots of other benefits. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jakob. We now start the discussion amongst us. So the first is Stefan Collignon.
This was
Do we have mic?
ceiling mics. The mic, to speak up.
They're in the ceiling.
Okay, sorry, good. So this was a great day for European intellectuals, because if there's one thing European intellectuals love, it's doom and gloom, and to see a problem behind the problem behind the problem. And then they come up with these wonderful talks about we need to think more about thinking more about thinking more. And so that's great. I, for a moment, got terribly depressed hearing about Europe again. And then I thought, actually, what's the reality? The reality is actually much better. I agree totally with what was just said about the financial situation. But look at unemployment is down nearly everywhere in Europe. Inflation doesn't even exist. We thought for a long time that's a real problem in Europe, right? Economic growth is still positive after all. We are not in a recession. And there are some estimates who say that Europe is a net beneficiary from the trade war between America and China. If you look on the political side, the young people get mobilized for climate change and future green futures and whatever. The Lega is out of government in Italy. In Poland, the Conservative Party has lost majority in the Senate. Brexit is a warning to everyone that it's a disaster to do so. And Macron is now in the newspapers increasingly being written up as like his reforms are working. And after all, Merkel is going to be out very soon. So I think the future is bright for Europe, and we shouldn't get into doom and gloom.
My name is Judith Marquise. I'm a former member of the European Parliament. Thank you so much for this discussion today. I agree completely with Stefan that it is not only doom and gloom. I do agree with you, Vivian, that about the politicization. And the fact is that the politicization has not taken place in the parties. It has taken place outside of political parties. Political parties have become more managers than they actually have developed political vision. What we do need in Europe are real European thinking parties, and not only like Europe is great, which would be lovely, but that you would see that the SPD is actually the Social Democrat movement, the party in Europe, or the Conservative Party is actually a conservative party in Europe. We have seen, so therefore not that much doom and gloom, the beginning of that with trying to get a president for the Commission by trying to have the Spitzenkandidat with Weber and Franz Timmermans. That was more or less the beginning of a political, broad European thinking movement in the parties. Unfortunately, indeed, because of new geopolitical thinking in the national government, that movement has been killed straight away. And the thing is, indeed, that you get the political movement then outside of our countries. Henrik, the whole thing with the regulatory zone between two countries has already been tried, and it failed, unfortunately, between the Netherlands and Germany, which means that what we need is the mirror to economic politics, and that is that the national governments have to give up their last resort, which is social policy, fiscal policy, taxation, pension funds, everything, in order to mirror the power of Europe, which is economics, which means that private law has to move more also towards European law.
Yes. Thank you very much. My name is Alvaro Renedo. I'm a Spanish career diplomat and currently a fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Thank you very much for the fascinating and timely discussion. I have a question for Dr. Enderlein. When you outline the priorities for Europe for the upcoming years on growth, industrial policy, etc., I couldn't agree more. But honestly, I missed a reference to social cohesion and welfare. So Harvard University's Jason Beckfield recently published a study on rising inequality in Europe based on individual and household level income data, on macro level data on social policies, and on case studies based on welfare reforms. In my firsthand experience in the European Council as Spanish Sherpa, I witnessed how a perception of inequality can fuel populist movements and poses challenges to the European project as a whole. And I believe it is psychologically associated to the issue of legitimacy and ownership of the whole project. Thank you very much.
Henrik, would you like to start?
How do we do this? I mean, we all have a number of reactions, I think. Should we just
Yeah.
to individual?
No.
I mean, I start with the last point.
This discussion about I start with the last point. This discussion about what is good for societies, which came up at many points during this discussion, I think right now is a really difficult one. If I ask my children in Berlin, they would say it's all about climate change. And we cannot continue with growth. I challenge this. I think the growth discussion continues to be very important because it's only when you have growth rates that are positive that you can actually start to think about redistribution. But that very basis, Jeff, you know this as well from students, is now questioned increasingly. So that's one way to answer your question, to say, well, perhaps we shouldn't even have a growth discussion. We should have a pure redistributive discussion, given the climate change discussion. That's not what you said. I'm very well aware. The second way to say, to answer your question would be to say, well, let's continue to push the growth agenda, but let's make sure that the receipts of this growth are fairly distributed. Now, I'm all in favor of that at the country level. I just think that the European Union is not yet there at the EU level across countries. And the reason is quite simple. The inequalities within the European Union and the euro area are such that we cannot even start to aim at having this kind of discussion. One of the poison pills in the political discussion was this discussion about the European unemployment insurance. And the reason is I like the project as such, but it's often misunderstood. The idea was not to say that we would pay from, let's say, Germany, unemployed people in Spain. That's not the idea. We talk about an unemployment reinsurance system that actually only hits in a cyclical destabilization context. I've done work on this, and you could see that Germany would have received money during the years 2003, 2004, because we had the highest unemployment rate in the European Union and actually deviated from the cycle. So that's the idea which is on the table. But obviously many people jumped on this unemployment insurance idea to say, hey, that's great, you know, we finally get solidarity and the rich Germans will pay for our unemployed. That's not on the agenda. So I think redistribution, as much as I agree, and there was a fantastic conference at PIE, perhaps Jean can say a few words last week about inequality. I think that's a key discussion we should have. If you allow me, I would like to make 3 other points. The first one, Judith, is on the Spitzenkandidaten discussion. Now, let's be honest with ourselves for a minute. In 2013, before the last European election, Michel Barnier was candidate for the Conservatives, and Jean-Claude Juncker was a candidate. The Spitzenkandidaten idea was out there. Why did the German CDU vote for Jean-Claude Juncker? Because they were convinced Juncker was not willing to take the job. Everyone believed Juncker had no interest in becoming Commission President. When Juncker was elected, there was a big campaign by Merkel trying to prevent Juncker from doing it. So there's actually a link between Martin Schulz and Jean-Claude Juncker to say, you know, you do it so that we keep the Spitzenkandidaten process alive. Fast forward, a year ago, we had the discussion about the European Spitzenkandidaten. So the candidates on the conservative side, and it was clear that the conservatives would become the strongest party to most observers, we had Alex Stubb, who is someone who is a former head of state, very eloquent, dynamic leader. Why was he not elected? Well, they voted for Weber because they knew Weber was not going to become Commission president, nor would be Timmermans. And everyone in Berlin, that was an open secret, in Brussels as well. Everyone knew Manfred Weber had no chance of actually getting that job. And so, in that sense, I think it wasn't really a killing of the Spitzenkandidaten process in this decision. It was the vote of the European People's Party voting for these candidates that actually weakened the process. My prediction for next time is this: next time around, we will actually vote for the best candidates, and then we will actually have the Spitzenkandidaten process that could be a result of this process, and that would be very interesting. Because Michel Barnier knows very well, had he run this time, he would have been elected by the EPP, and I think he would be Commission president by now. One of the big mistakes in politics. So I think it's important to make clear that it's not just Macron who killed the Spitzenkandidaten process overnight because he didn't like Weber. It's more complex than that. The other ones are very short. Jeff, on recession in Germany, you know, it's a tricky issue. You mentioned the IMF number, which is 0.5 growth for Germany next year. This is, if I'm not mistaken, seasonally adjusted. Germany will grow 0.4% next year simply through the calendar effect. The German calculation of the growth rate of the government calculation of the growth rate will therefore predict 0.9 if they take IMF data, and from there it's only very little to get to 1%. That is not a recession. And so when people talk about a recession in Germany, I would be very hesitant. This is where I don't buy into the doom and gloom part. Did I make something, a mistake, Jean? No,
The calendar contribution is positive.
It's positive, yeah.
So if the IMF say 0.5?
We would be at 0.9.
The IMF says point.
Official estimates, for Germany, it's 1.0.
Yeah.
And you have to subtract, in order to standardize it, 0.4 percentage points because of calendar effects. Basically, if you're having fewer holidays because the weekends fall as they fall, and therefore is sort of adjusted for calendar effect. Our baseline prediction, that's OECD, IMF, and the German government one, is 0.6 for next year. This is what Henrik was saying.
Exactly. So the point is, politically, what will be read when Jakob is going to publish his forecast, or the German government, will be closer to 1, because you do nominal and you don't do the 0.6, which takes into account the calendar effect. That's the interesting point, and therefore I think this discussion about a recession triggering a fiscal stimulus is not straightforward. One point on you, Jakob, and then I end. I mean, I very much agree that we should try to reach the top of the mountain on a different path, and I very much hope that France and Germany will find a way to determine this new path together. The challenge is that if you look at the points you raised, climate, digitalization, France and Germany today are not on the same page. I take 2 examples. The copyright directive, which was very controversial in Europe. The German dominant view, which was not the government view, the population view, was that should never be done. They sided with Google, with Facebook, with Apple, and the others. All the younger activists were all on that side. In France, you had the entirely opposite positioning, where people said we need to do something against the GAFA, as they are called in France. And so you have 2 very different discussions. The climate change discussion is another important item. When you talk to French people today about how to reduce CO2, they look at you and say, well, you know, nuclear is a solution. If you come up with the same argument in Germany, people would say, the last thing we want is nuclear, and not from France. And so I'm very happy that we try to see in which direction we want to go, but my fear, and I'm not a pessimist, pessimist, no, that's arrogant, but sometimes people say the pessimist is the well-informed optimist. I said it was arrogant, so let's take this out of the equation. But if France walks in this direction and Germany walks in that direction, my prediction as an observer is just not they're going to walk the same way in these discussions.
Yeah, a few points. First, on what you said on reform, I mean, policy by stealth. I don't think the ECB, ran this policy by stealth. They said it very clearly. It was within their mandate. I mean, they were confronted to an unforeseen situation. They had the tools to do it, and they did it. And actually, it has been less controversial than sometimes emphasized, because there were discussion, there were sensitivities, but on the whole, they've been able to act, and they've been acting relatively successfully. At least, I mean, this contributed a lot to what we've seen as a pickup in growth. Although you're confronted to new difficulties, which bring me to my second point about the doom and gloom. I don't think it's doom and gloom to be lucid about the difficulties we're seeing ahead of us, and I agree with Jeff on the policy space we have, and the discussion we need to have on how to broaden this policy space. We have no monetary policy space. We have very limited fiscal policy space, and the slowdown is here, and the risk of an aggravation does exist, both because of the external shocks and because of the relative weakness of the endogenous policy response, for the reason that the space is limited. So thinking about how to address that, I think, is absolutely necessary, and it's not a manifestation of doom and gloom. Now, on my third point is on social cohesion and inequality. I think that's, in general, I mean, the sensitivity to this question has increased everywhere. It has increased in Europe, and for good reasons. I mean, we don't have, obviously, in Europe, in general, we don't have the rise of inequalities that we have observed in this country and in a number of other countries in the world, by far. But there has been a certain rise in inequality. There has been there have been significant locational differences, so both in terms of countries, but also in terms of regions. And more we're seeing that. And I think that it's a challenge for the EU, because the usual contract is that the EU doesn't care about inequality. The EU cares essentially about efficiency, and inequality is a business of the member states. This is true, including for the policies that are driven by the EU, which have distributional consequences. So trade policy has distributional consequences. And part of the discontent we've seen in this country, we're seeing it also in Europe for exactly the same reasons, that some localities, some cities have been devastated by trade opening, and people are stuck. The jobs have gone. They're stuck with a house that was nothing, and they live on benefits. So we have much better sort of shock absorbers in terms of the income, but in terms of the perspective, of the professional perspective, in terms of the development of cities and micro regions, we don't have it. And the same applies to regulatory policies, so a series of policies. And this contract of saying, we do these policies because it's the name of efficiency, but the member states, they care about the distribution consequences. I mean, you can understand technocratically how it makes sense, because the distributional instruments are in the hands of the member states. But politically, it can be very toxic, because the member states are going to blame the EU instead of really addressing the problem. So I think we need to rethink the way in which the EU can also offset some of the consequences of the policies it is promoting. The globalization fund that was created by Barroso as a sort of response to the early emergence of such discontent, by some estimates, it has been able to offset about sort of 4 or 5% of the consequences of the EU policies. This is ridiculous. I mean, this is absolutely ridiculous. You can do more, we can do more. And in particular, I think that the structural funds were invented in the 1980s with the idea that the consequences of EU policies would be felt at regional level. They're not felt at regional level, they're felt at sub-regional level. So this is a problem of granularity. I think we do have budgetary instruments that are misused because they're used to fund traditional type of infrastructure at regional level, whereas they would be much better, much more useful being used to respond with more granularity to the problem that EU policies have contributed to create in local communities.
Yeah, just to respond to Jean, there's no doubt that it's the Commission that is mainly sort of the headline is reinterpretation by stealth. But even the ECB, if we consider that it essentially hid the truth in plain view, it was massively reinterpreting its mandate, whilst always saying this is in my mandate. It went from Trichet, very narrow interpretation of the mandate, we can't be a lender of last resort, we can't do much of anything, to increasingly expanding that with we'll do whatever it takes and then quantitative easing. Yes, it's all in the mandate, but in fact, the interpretation changes massively.
Yeah,
And
but
that's really the
in
point.
a-
It's not by stealth,
No, it's not by
technically,
stealth.
but
I mean, you
it,
can have a change of a governor in the central bank that results in a change of the interpretation of what has to be done to fulfill a certain mandate. I don't think there was a shift. There was a significant shift. It was completely open, but it was within the mandate of the ECB.
so it's a reinterpretation of the rules, in this case, less, let's bracket, by stealth. But everywhere, there's a reinterpretation of the rules for all the actors. But leaving that aside and going back to some of the comments, Jakob, I love these ideas for the future. And in fact, it seems to me that this is the only way forward, because I don't see any of the investment, any of the things that I suggested doing in terms of fiscal federalism actually happening, which is why I said, you either have more or you have less, and allow the member states really to do more to invest. And I'm really thinking about Southern Europe in particular in order to promote growth. But Stefan, on the politics and on the sort of morose view, it may look a little bit better now, but the big question, and I think the big issue is, unless the EU starts doing more in terms of policies, all of this can go either way. But I don't want to just say that it's a question of the EU. It's also a question of the member states themselves. Because if we want to talk about a crisis of legitimacy, I've been talking about the EU, but the major crisis of legitimacy is at the national level. And a lot of it has to do with, as more and more policies get taken up by the EU, the member state leaders feel and governments have less and less room for maneuver. And so my suggestion that we flip the European semester and make it more bottom-up than top-down is actually to give more political space to national governments to make more, policies of the left or the right in terms of the economics in order to be able to counter the populists who claim that, it's all the same policies that you're doing and all following rules that don't work. What you need for the national level is actually to have policies that work. And for that, there needs to be more room. The governing by rules and ruling by numbers simply doesn't work. And this is also sort of to address the inequalities and social policy issues. I mean, It's at the national level that we see the problems, the peri-urban and rural areas that find themselves abandoned with less in the way of services and not being able to meet their needs by the end of the month. For that, you need more expansive policy, but there needs more growth, actually. It's back to the macroeconomics. There needs to be more growth across Europe. So we're almost at the sort of this never-ending vicious circle where you need this, that, and the other at all levels, but you've got to break in somewhere.
There's something about the quality of this. It's in the ceiling. Yep. There's something about the quality of this debate. Not only this debate, there's something about the quality of the Brexit debate. There is something about the quality of the Democratic Party primaries in this country. As if the international order is the same as it was 15 years ago, with no prospect of change. And we've got time, and there'll be some local crises, and we'll respond to them. And as characters change in Berlin and France, there can be divergence, convergence, etc. But in fact, for the first time in our lifetimes, geopolitics is potentially changing absolutely gigantically, much more than the end of the Cold War, which was a change in security policy, but it wasn't a change in the economic order very much at all for any of the countries that are being discussed here. The question I would like to ask is, what do you think Germany and France actually want from the global order in, say, I don't know, 20 years, 15, 25 years' time? And so what do you think they actually want, and what do you think they should want, to the extent that that is different, and how does it bear on this debate? Should there be an urgency, and say what Heinrich said is completely right. Is this kind of okay because there's time, or is it terrible because there isn't much time, given that given the potential changes in who runs the world? Can I add a transatlantic question to Paul's, which I would like to direct at Jeff. Jeff is a keen observer of Europe. Looking at the reaction of the European Union, France and Germany in particular, to Trump's policy, what do they do right and what do they do wrong in your opinion? Or what should they do?
Marco.
Yes, so perhaps on geopolitics, perhaps linking up to an observation that Henrik made, I think he rightly portrayed me as an optimist, and perhaps a naive one. There's a wonderful story of Jimmy Carter, who was reflecting on how to overcome the Cold War. And one of the ideas he came up with is if the extraterrestrians were to arrive, perhaps in the Soviet Union and the US could team up against them. And I think maybe it's a naive thought, but I don't think it's completely stupid to imagine that to some extent Trump and Xi Jinping are our extraterrestrians, and perhaps one day we'll give them the Charlemagne Prize to justice to their contribution. So while I completely agree that there are remaining differences, I think there are opportunities here. And similarly, if you look at things like climate change, I think there's a huge opportunity here. It used to be coal versus nuclear. Germany has decided to phase out coal by 2038. We're phasing out nuclear as well, fine. But I think we're much more aligned on energy policy than we used to be. And perhaps just sort of briefly coming back to your social question, one of the reasons why I think low for long is really interesting is because the way for the past generation we've looked at markets, single market in Europe, globalization, the perception of many was this is a ploy to pit abundant labor against each other in order to drive down wages and to make capitalists happy. I think in the low for long world, we have capital abundance and we have a relative scarcity of labor. And I think what we need to do is we need to pit the capitalists so that they compete down their rents and profits and so that labor can flourish. That's also very much a market idea. Thomas Philippon has an interesting book, a little bit along these lines, which sort of tries to spell out that agenda in the US context. But I think that's an interesting agenda, which sort of is a little bit in your spirit, but again, talking from a German history, finance perspective, has less of the sort of dangers of the debate about transfer union. It's, you know, this is not about transfer union. This is about, you know, making market work for normal people.
Paul, I like that question a lot, and I think you're absolutely right to point to this security challenge. And perhaps that's the area where France and Germany really speak still a very different language. And perhaps it's not Germany and France, but it's Merkel and Macron.
They're from different generations. I think Merkel, to me, embodies what society in Germany is thinking, which can be summarized, I think Thomas Bagger, whom some of you know, who is a German diplomat, once wrote as, more or less I'm paraphrasing, Germany has never really recovered from the 1989 end of history moment. And I think that's absolutely right. So they sit here and think history's over, right? The good guys have won, or good girls, and we're all on the same path. And now we just need to wait for the rest of the world to become all democracies. Growth is all everywhere, and things are fine. So history is over. And Merkel's strategic policy is clearly that. You know, we don't do anything. We just wait. Macron is the exact opposite. Macron is the one saying, you know, France has been observing what's going on in the world for far too long, essentially since Mitterrand. And now I want, as one of the nuclear powers, take control, strategic control of how this world is going to develop. And this is why he thinks he can solve the Iran issue between the US and Rouhani. This is why he thinks he can fix the China-US trade problem. This is why he believes Albania should not become a member of the European Union, because this actually is a problem for Putin. And you know, Albania, North Macedonia, Kosovo, this is sending the wrong message to Russia. And so we actually need to think 20, 30, 40, 50 years ahead. Macron is the strategic thinker. And they're really from Mars and Venus today. And there's this anecdote about Merkel after one European Council on the top jobs, walking out of the room and saying to Macron, you need to explain to me one day what you're doing in Africa. And Macron looked at her and she said, you know, take a map, sit down and tell me what you're doing there. I don't understand. And they did that, if my information is right. They sat there over dinner at a few weeks later with a map of Africa, and Macron told her, you know, this is Mali, this is where we are, this is our zone of influence, etc. That's not Merkel's mindset. And so this is really where the two don't cooperate. Macron's perspective, he said so relatively explicitly recently, Macron's perspective on NATO is clear. We don't need NATO. Europe should have its own security. And you asked the normative question, what should they do? I think I'm quite sympathetic to this. I think we need NATO. But I think the European Union needs to get its act together with a common security policy. And that can only work with Franco-German agreement. I know Karl doesn't agree with that. I know many Americans don't agree with that. And, but looking at what's happening here, it didn't start with Trump only. When Obama made the mistake in Syria, it was very clear for everyone that Europe suddenly was looking at a partner in NATO that was not as reliable as before. I end with my remark to Jakob. You know, the optimist and the pessimist, you never know who is going to be right, but the optimist has a much nicer life, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you emphasize a lot the difference in personal attitudes between Macron and Merkel, and that's absolutely right. I mean, it doesn't tell us anything about the interest of the respective countries. You know, it's true that we're coming from different traditions. It's true that the way we manage foreign relation, and especially with the way we manage the military is completely different. I mean, the French president can decide that tomorrow morning we are going to send, aircraft and to intervene, and it actually happened repeatedly. So, and in Germany, it's inconceivable. But does it change something to the sort of fundamental interest of the two countries? And I don't think we are that much split. I mean, with respect to the big geopolitical changes that Paul mentioned. Your starting point was not exactly what's going on in Mali or whatever. I mean, it's really the change in the U.S. perspective on international relations. It was the rise of China, the structuring character of this U.S.-China rivalry, the magnitude of the instability around Europe, the risks involved in migration from whatever cause, can be political, can be climatic. I mean, all that very much finds France and Germany on the same page in terms of fundamental interest. Now you have history, you have institutions, you have all that, you have sort of reflexes, and these are different. These are different.
John, so a Chinese political scientist, Yan Zuotong, said a few years ago when asked about Europe, my hope for Europe is that when the US and China actually have a war, that Europe will remain neutral. What each of you, this is a, Jeff's responding in the way that I did when I first read it, kind of, whew. What do you think about this kind of question and how it would be resolved in our part of the world? Because if you want to answer that question one way, it implies very different than another. It implies very different things in terms of the construction of Europe.
I don't want to make a prediction on that, but I want to emphasize that the challenge represented by China to the US and to Europe is not the same. I mean, there's a lot in common as far as disciplining China is concerned. Both disciplining from an economic standpoint, from an external relations standpoint, from what's happening in the South China Sea, etc. But the U.S. Perspective, which is that China is a strategic rival and a threat to the dominance of the U.S., is not shared by Europe because we're not a dominant power. So we would wish, and we would certainly play with the U.S. as far as it is about, making China play by the rules. We won't play necessarily with the U.S. as far as it is, countering the rise of a rival.
As the American on the panel, I guess I should say something about Donald Trump, as difficult as that is. And in response to Carl's question, one is just tempted to throw up one's hands. It is too much to hope that after Donald Trump, that we will be able to go back. I know it's too much to hope that we'll just be able to go back to the world as it was in the 90s with the open multilateral system, respect for rules, and the rest of it, and with some, with U.S. leadership. But I'll try to be an optimist and say we can't go all the way back, but we can go part way back. I mean, for one thing, Paul, I mean, the end of the Cold War, that was an awfully major event, and it wasn't just for security. The developing countries gave up on, for the most part, on extreme state planning and adopted basically the market capitalism system. That was a huge change and has had huge results. Ironically, of course, the capitalism is now questioned often in the West. Vivian mentioned the populists. I think she said that the left parties and the Republicans and Democrats, or the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, it's all the same. They all follow the same policies. And I think that's one of the biggest problems, is that people perceive that. I think it's so wrong. It's so false. There's a whole range of policies, and some of them are very sensible. And an answer to the first question from our Spanish Sherpa on how it can combine growth with regard for equality and the environment. I mean, I'm an economist. I believe economists don't believe in maximizing GDP, whatever you've heard. We believe in maximizing whatever it is you want to maximize, subject to constraints. And what we want to maximize is some combination of the size of the total pie, the equality of the distribution, the quality of the environment. And there are sensible policies that will do that. I thought the banning, you said the Germans, the last thing we want is nuclear. Well, is it really? Isn't coal the last thing you want? I mean, coal is worse for local pollution, worse for global climate change, worse for mortality and accidents on the historical record. And it seems to me Germany has largely closed down nuclear power plants in many cases before the end of their useful lives, and substituted into coal. U.S. Politicians, U.S. political process is swinging wildly between absurdly right-wing positions and absurdly right from right to left, and not passing through the middle. I mean, whether it's health insurance or the Green New Deal or the progressive tax system or financial regulation, there's sensible, moderate middle ground. Just to take health insurance, when Obama was president, a majority of Americans were supposedly against Obamacare. He couldn't get the public option through. The Republicans blocked it, dismantled it, undercut it. And now all of a sudden we're swinging back to the opposite extreme of the leading, apparently leading Democratic candidate being in favor of Medicare for all, interpreted as not letting people have private insurance. I mean, how can we swing from such great extremes without passing through a reasonable middle ground, which is what Obama wanted in the first place, which is to increase health insurance to cover everybody through a public option. And I sort of wish, and I don't just blame the right wing, I blame the left wing for not paying more attention to the fact that there are sensible proposals on making the income tax system more progressive, and financial regulation, things that have been proposed by Democratic presidents and Democratic senators and have been passed to some extent, but often blocked by Republicans. And the people on the far left say, oh, there's no difference, and instead we need to do these crazy things.
Which are done in Europe.
Well, I mean, by the way, on the healthcare, sure. On healthcare, I understand that universal coverage from the government is perfectly reasonable if we're not starting from there. And you know the argument. 70% of Americans get their health insurance from their employers, and most of them would prefer to keep that relative to single payer.
Okay, very briefly.
Very brief.
Yeah. So no time was the question. I see no time. I mean, I see that things need to be done now. If we talk security and defense, the EU is woefully unprepared for where it is. It's in a very dangerous neighborhood, and it's basically dependent upon the U.S. for way too long. And what needs to be done is somehow for the EU to develop serious security and defense. So long as the U.S. wants to be there, fine. But ultimately, I think the EU needs to take over NATO. It needs to take over those capabilities. And some kind of merging of common security and defense policy with NATO seems to be the only possible way forward, since the EU is not exactly prepared for that now, but needs to be pretty quickly. But that's outside my domain. That was just a comment. But my remit was to talk about legitimacy and the politics side, and we also have no time there. it seems to me. We're at a very dangerous moment. Talk about illiberal democracy in the post-communist countries, where there's a sort of a pro-authoritarian move. And what is interesting is, since Brexit, yes, many populist parties have said we don't want to leave the EU or the euro, if they're in. But what we want is a different Europe. So a Europe of different values, different norms, more illiberal, and possibly much friendlier to the authoritarian democracies, if you can call it that, or just authoritarian systems, to the east. That is highly dangerous. That's very dangerous for liberal democracy. So I do see the liberal world order under threat, not only in the US, where we see the crumbling of what's been called the deep state as it's being hollowed out from within, but also the liberal world order in terms of a global order of alliances, et cetera. But beyond that, the rise of nationalism, the rise of populists, and also the transnational networks. I mean, there's a comment earlier about political parties. Political parties, mainstream parties, need to start using social media much more actively. It's the populists who are doing this through transnational networks as well. And I was in Rome last March. There was Steve Bannon. He's all over the place as well. And so I think, just to end, we're at a very dangerous moment. Something, the center, you're absolutely right, Jeff, needs to do something.
I'd like to summarize what I learned from this very rapidly in 3 minutes. So 5 points. The first was, Hendrik was saying, we need France and Germany to push things. That's historically very much confirmed and validated, but he's very skeptic about the possibility of that happening. Jean's point was largely and mainly about there are new, so he was much more positive. There are new challenges and there are new ways to go about it. And we might also think about what the French used to call géométrie variable, what we have in many domains. Vivian was very much forward-looking. For example, she said we need a decent European budget, we need a decent backstop to the restructuring mechanism. So all no-nos in a German debate. I didn't even listen to that, by the way.
Of course. And I knew you wouldn't.
And then there was Jeff, who spoke of we need much more fiscal policy in terms of supporting. Actually, that's completely my view. The current way of undermining the autonomy of the central bank results largely from fiscal policy not pursuing its remit. And the worst are the Germans, by far. They're pushing all the bad stuff on ECB's turf, and at the same time complaining about ECB not pursuing. It's ridiculous. My final point was, whom did I forget? Jakob was most constructive and very, very positive, and I like most of the views, so I shouldn't commend them on them. But I have one issue with Macron. This is about, he has brilliant ideas, raising expectations sky high at a minimum. And just let's talk about these two beautiful speeches referring to the EU or the Euro area budget. He never mentioned numbers. But he should know numbers because there was a report of the Trésor in 2014 when they actually made a discussion about that. And I think at that time he was pretty close to that. And they mentioned a number, which was between 5 to 7%. An old figure, McDougall's had a report in 1977 highlighted that. So imagine, France has 56% of its GDP in the public sector. Would that come on top of it? If not, would it mean 7% of sovereignty of France being devolved to the EU level? I'm a little bit puzzled. I think that's pretty.
There was never the idea of a 7%, 5 to 7% of GDP budget. Just remember the number that came out.
There wasn't
17 billion over 5 years, right?
Now, but Jean,
but I mean,
Jean,
the hope was never 5%.
Jean,
The hope was never 5%.
the report of the Treasury of 2014. Did they mention a number?
It was yes. I mean, there was a sort of a study of various options.
So my
It
point-
was not.
my-
It was not a government.
Sure,
It was not.
was
a government
not
position.
was experts in the Treasury. So my point is about, and I liked very much what we did today. That's why I want to thank anybody and everybody participating here. We should be sober, and we should also acknowledge, and that's what I learned over a very long time, to listen to what is going on in internal debates. And we do not know enough about what is going on in the intra-German debate. We do not know what is happening in France. And we don't know at all what is going on in Spain or Italy. So that's very much, by the way, it's not doom and gloom, it's positive. It's about learning, it's about understanding. And you would understand possibly the migration policy of the current French government if you think about municipal elections currently happening and why the French president doesn't want 100 members of his party to publish an article in a journal. That would be somehow inconceivable in Germany, that the president or the chancellor can prevent parliamentarians from expressing their views. On this somehow positive note, Stefan, thank you very much for contributing to this, and thank you very much for sharing this day with us.
Gracias,